On April 18th, 2014, one of the most famous, or infamous even, authors, Colleen Hoover, wrote a book called Maybe Someday. Or rather, it was released then. Anyhow, also I say infamous because if you know the controversy behind Colleen Hoover, that might be a more appropriate word. But anyhow, she released a book called Maybe Someday, and there is a deaf character in this. Now, if you want a review or my thoughts on the entire book as a whole, the romance, the plot in general included, I have a second channel that is all about books and writing, so you're going to want to check that out over there after watching this, of course. Here, we are specifically going to talk about whether or not Colleen Hoover can write a deaf character. And that answer, both unfortunately and fortunately, is yes. The reason why I say unfortunately is because I have to be nice to her for a minute, or I feel like I have to be nice to her, but it's true. Now, does that mean there weren't things that made me annoyed? Of course not, but it annoys me because it's true. So, Maybe Someday is actually one of the more tame romance books that she has that doesn't really make you mad. Actually, in terms of the romance, unless cheating makes you mad, which it should. But 22-year-old Sydney has just found out that her boyfriend at the time and her roommate, also her best friend, have been sleeping together behind Sydney's back. And so now she's sad. She has to move out. She doesn't really know what she's going to be doing now because that was kind of her whole entire life. Until she found out though, she has a neighbor from across the complex named Rich who has been sitting out on the balcony and he plays guitar. He's a musician. Sydney is also very much into music, so she loved to go out onto the balcony whenever that he was, on the balcony himself on his own and was playing guitar. She was really attracted to that, very enticed by the music. And as it turns out, Rich has known all along that she has been cheated on. She finds out, I believe he tells her, and then she gets that confirmed, and now she's kind of homeless, but Rich will now take her in because he feels bad. For about 2 weeks, these two are texting back and forth, and you don't really know that he's deaf until there's actually some context clues here. Sydney texts, so do you want me to call you after I get home? Rich says, just text me. When they're in person, she says, I need a drink, and asks if he has any alcohol, and he's looking down at his phone, so he doesn't know that she's talking to him, and she's very annoyed by that. She's like, he either can't do two things at once, or he's upset that, I had an attitude with him. Of course, because Sydney doesn't know that he's deaf yet, she's just moving herself around while she talks, as hearing people do, as I do even, when I'm talking to a hearing person, of course. And she gets a text message from him, and he says, if you weren't going to look at me when you speak, you might want to stick to texting. And she's so confused. She's like, why are you telling me this? Like, I don't understand. And he finally tells her. He says, I'm deaf, Sydney. And she's so confused by that too, because he's like, but we've had so many conversations. And that's when she starts to realize, hey, they've only been texting. And thus begins this relationship, friendship. Really, it's a friendship because Rich has a girlfriend, and thus begins this whole love triangle. And again, if you want to know my whole thoughts on that, that's in the second channel video review. Rich was written pretty well, considering. I hate to say that this was written better than the character in Hush. Now, granted, books and movies are two very different media. With books, anything is possible, although, well, because anything is possible, it could also be written terribly. But you're not trying to match up like a hearing actor with a deaf role. So Rich is the only deaf person in the apartment, and he has one roommate who's very rude, and she's always screaming at him. Not in a I'm screaming at you and abusing you type of way, but in the, well, he's deaf so he can't hear me, so obviously that means I must scream at him and therefore he will hear me then. And it's the weirdest thing. And she does the same thing to Sydney when she first is moved in, because she's not talking, so she thinks, that's why she must scream at her. And that's the thing, hearing people do tend to do that. Not everybody, but I know some people who will, sometimes they will talk a little bit louder because, well, especially now that I have my hearing aids in, but way back when my hearing was a little bit better, people would try to talk a lot more loudly. And sometimes that works, sometimes that does not. But usually how it's written here, it's a period after every word. So you know she's doing her talking like this. And mouth movements do not look natural, which means that they're not gonna understand. Like, we have a much more difficult time understanding that usually. Maybe there's somebody who's better with that, I don't know, but usually it's much more difficult to understand somebody when they are just over enunciating their words and practically screaming. Ridge's best friend is actually a coda, so what's his name? Warren knows ASL. I'm pretty sure Warren is a coda and that's how he knows ASL, so that works out just fine. And of course those two are communicating in ASL. Ridge has a younger brother who I believe knows some ASL. At this time I cannot remember how fluent the brother was, but I know that Ridge had to teach his brother as much ASL as possible because, and this is the most common thing, Ridge's parents would not learn ASL for their child, their deaf child. His father was the worst out of the two. I don't think he really talks about his mother as much in the book, but he talks about his father a lot, how his father really didn't like the sound of Ridge's voice and was very embarrassed by him every time that he talked because Ridge had more of the deaf accent. Yeah, Ridge's parents were just the typical family where it's, you know, like, what's the percentage? A very high percentage of deaf children born to hearing families will be living with a family that does not learn ASL for their deaf child. Thus comes the whole language deprivation argument. That was done right. Like I said before, Ridge is a musician. He plays guitar. And there are instruments that don't really require hearing. I think it's more the percussion types of instruments. I am not a music person beyond like listening to it and liking things, so please correct me if I'm wrong because I can't remember the terms for things right now. But things like drums and piano, those are like music instruments that are easier to learn how to play for deaf people just because you don't really have to listen to things. Although I would imagine, don't you have to tune a piano? I don't know, I'm going by watching Orange Days, right? With guitar, it's a little bit harder, I think, from what I know, for deaf people to be able to learn. I actually attempted to learn it once upon a time. And, well, since I never actually got any lessons, like, I'm sure that didn't help my confusion while trying to play it. I imagine me trying to tune things probably wouldn't work out very well. But, of course, Sydney has questions, and again, we're fine with questions. Sydney is kind of really weird about it in her monologues, but you know, she's asking questions like, how can you know, play music and do it so well, etc., etc. And we're just talking about how, you know, there's a deaf spectrum and he has his own way of learning things. Mandy Harvey is deaf, she's a singer, and she plays guitar. So those two would be able to relate to that. I can't remember exactly how Mandy learned a guitar and how she still remembers how to play it and all of that. She might have that written all out in her memoir, and she's probably talked about it online. And speaking of deafness on a spectrum, Ridge has a girlfriend named Maggie who is also deaf. Maggie is actually more, I want to say Ridge is like profoundly deaf. He'd be like severely to profoundly deaf. Maggie is probably, if I were to guess, because I don't think it's really mentioned, well, I think at one point it says she has mild hearing loss and she wears hearing aids. I wear hearing aids and I'm severe to profound, actually. So that's the whole thing. Maggie has hearing aids, she has mild hearing loss, and she lip reads people. And if I recall, Sydney had to say that Maggie does not have the deaf accent that Ridge has. So I did like that there was an explanation from Ridge about, you know, the spectrum of deafness and how he has different ways of playing music, how he learns with physical touch, feeling the vibrations, because that all is true. I have no idea if Colleen consulted with anybody before writing this or if she sent it off to sensitivity readers. I know none of that, but I'm surprisingly and pleasantly surprised and shocked. One of the main things that was grinding my gears, but of course it was true because I know this from personal experience and just reading everybody else's experience, Sydney spends about, I want to say, 6 months with Ridge, living with Ridge, and she doesn't bother to learn ASL once. She doesn't ask Warren, she doesn't ask Ridge to teach her, she doesn't, go online and look up some videos, she doesn't go to the library, which is a place I believe she used to work at, to check out any books. Granted, I don't really recommend learning ASL from books, at least the signs themselves, because it's a 3D language and not a 2D, but I digress, that's besides the point. She has all this time where she's not doing anything because she doesn't have a job, she's not going to school. I don't think that's left my mind, but she has all this time and she doesn't even bother learning a single sign. So they're still just texting forever, and there are moments when she gets so frustrated that they're not communicating very well because she's trying to ask him stuff or tell him stuff, and then he's just texting her, and she doesn't really like that because it takes too long. Listen, I was in a relationship, if you can call it that, for 2 years where my ex was not learning to sign. And one, I also didn't have hearing aids then. So he would just mostly be writing to me on his phone, and it was the worst way of communication. There was so much miscommunication just because you don't really get your feelings out. There's no emotion. Anything that could take 2 minutes ends up taking 20 because you're waiting for the other person. You're waiting for him. I'm waiting for him to type, and it went on for way longer than it should have, but that's why I can tell you that that's just not the way to go. And even though they weren't in a relationship, they were still emotionally, Ridge was emotionally cheating on his girlfriend, and Sydney was falling for him. They were falling for each other, and there's that whole back and forth. Yet she doesn't bother to learn ASL, and she's getting so upset. All you had to do, girl, was learn some ASL. You didn't have to be fluent by next week. We know you weren't going to be fluent in 6 months. That's usually never, or it's just usually not going to happen for people unless you were practicing 24/7. But you didn't attempt to do anything, and if you were so frustrated by the miscommunication between you and this deaf man, why weren't you doing anything about it? You had all the time in the world, and it's so much easier for you to learn. At least I would like to think, because it doesn't seem like she had any, learning disabilities and whatnot. It would have been easier for her to learn ASL than for him to try to lip read her and all of that. It isn't until near the end of the book, the last 2 chapters or whatever, when the whole showdown is over and, it's the third act breakup of the other couple has happened, and now they're gonna finally get together. Then is when she's learned 200 signs. But before we can get into that, in that third act, there is a moment where, so people like to make a big deal out of deaf people's voices. People mention my voice in the comments very, very often. I've been speaking since I was the age that kids speak, right? So this is nothing new for me. But anyhow, Ridge does not speak. He's gone through this whole speech to Sydney about why he doesn't speak because of his father. He's never even told Maggie this, which was a shocker to me. At one point, when third act is happening, the big showdown has been happening, he finally speaks to her, and it's this weird hearing savior complex moment where she's suddenly melting, she's head over heels even more, and now suddenly she's obsessed because he started speaking. And listen, again, I obviously speak. I've been speaking all my life. I grew up mainstreamed. English is my first and native language, and that's the language I use the most because it's what I'm fluent in, right? But I get very weird when people get very fascinated with my speaking skills, because that's not what's important here. If Ridge wants to speak, then by all means, deaf people have the beauty of choice, and they can choose to speak if they wish to, or they can just sign if they want to, or they can, do both, sign and speak at the same time. But Sydney always had these moments where it felt like she wanted nothing more than for him to just speak to her. And it was just so uncomfortable to read. But it happens. These are things that happen in real life. But it was still so uncomfortable to read. And then, of course, while Sydney is learning those 200 signs, which isn't a bad thing, I'm just saying, I'm being specific because she was. So while Sydney was learning those 200 signs, Ridge was somehow nearly becoming this man who could speak extremely well within 3 months, I can't remember. Now granted, I've been speaking all my life and I never had speech therapy. I just did it. Again, granted, I had better hearing when I was a child, so that plays a role in that. I don't know, that seemed like a very quick amount of time, so that might be the one of the few moments in the book where it's like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. I don't know. And that's essentially it. You know, it's a romance novel. These two get together and there's a sequel, and I think it's more focused on Maggie and the roommates. Ridge and Sydney are in this book, obviously, and to my knowledge the whole miscommunication thing doesn't get any better, because it seems that they're still texting a lot and Sydney still isn't really continuing to learn ASL. She's not making a real effort in it. Don't quote me though, that's just what I've heard from comments that were left in my video review on the other channel. I'm honestly not sure if I will ever read the sequel. If I somehow come across it in the library or in a free little library, then I might. Or I might even buy in a used bookstore, because I learned that authors don't get royalties if you buy books secondhand, which kind of bums me out, but also at the same time I don't really want to give Colleen Hoover money. Do I accidentally give her money if I check her books out in the library? I don't know, but anyway, this is for work. This is for research, so this is for education purposes. Anyhow, overall, I was pleasantly surprised at how decent Ridge was written as a deaf person. I really didn't have many complaints other than the weird hearing savior complex, but that comes from Sydney, not from Ridge. Am I going to tell you to read this book? I'm not going to tell you to do anything. You could read the book if you want. You can not read the book if you don't want to. I'm just here to do my little deaf representation, critique, review, my own personal opinions, and you can choose to do what you wish with that. I mean, believe me, I know why people don't like Colleen Hoover a lot, and I've read more books from her. I read It Ends With Us, which I actually didn't hate generally, but I really didn't like the message that was being thrown to the reader, or what it was insinuating. I didn't like that very much. And I did read Verity, which I actually kind of liked. I had my issues with it, but I kind of liked that one. But overall, you're not going to find me really, like, getting excited to read a Colleen Hoover book, because, I don't know. I've watched other reviews on her stuff, and those are definitely, there are definitely books out there where I'm like, there's absolutely no reason why this should have been written, because that's gross, considering everything with her son that has happened, and just other stuff. It's gross. I'm not saying authors can't read, or they can't write about bad things that happen. That's absolutely 100% unrealistic. You're also talking to a horror fanatic. But it's just, there's ways, in my opinion, there are ways of going about this in a way that Colleen Hoover goes about it, on top of what happens in her real life and how she's reacted to that, with her son doing very bad things to people. That's my thoughts on that. Overall, Ridge makes a great character, and some or most of the death-related things I want to say are pretty correct. At least from my personal experience. I could be wrong about some things. But yeah, let me know if you've read this book and what you think of it down below. Again, if you want to know my full thoughts about the book as a whole with romance plots and stuff like that, check out the video. I'll have it linked somewhere here if I didn't already. Have it linked down below, and I would absolutely appreciate it if you came over to the second channel, because we're having a good fun time over there, and I really like books and writing, and I'm happy to get to talk about that now. If you would like to support the work that I do, and I have more book reviews that happen on there, I do have a Patreon page, so you get more content, book stuff, just a bunch of stuff, and it helps me to be able to fund that, so I will have that link down below as well. There's also a super thanks down here if you don't want to do a one-time commitment or become a channel member, which is somewhere down here as well. If you have not yet, please consider subscribing, liking the video, giving it a share. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. I very much appreciate it, and I will see you later.